Welcome, everybody. My name is Claire Robinson. I am the Director of Special Events and Institutional Advancement at RISD. Welcome to this session on the CRIT as part of our RISD weekend slate of events. I hope that some of you have joined us for our other virtual events, or maybe were with us this past weekend on campus. But if you weren't able to make some of those, please know that we will be posting them online in the future, as well as recording this session. So very excited to have Mickey Ackerman and Jonathan Sylvia with us today. Mickey is a professor in experimental and foundation studies at RISD and also an alum of the industrial design department, has his master's there. And Jonathan is a studio advisor as well from experimental and foundation studies. So I want to welcome you both. And you can look to the chat to find a more expanded version of their bios. But thank you so much for coming to talk to us today about what really happens at RISD during the CRIT process.
Absolutely.
Welcome everyone. So happy to have you here. So Jonathan and I have been asked to have a conversation about critique at RISD. And so, I think maybe the best way for us to start is to talk a little bit about ourselves or our teaching, and then talk about critique. So Jonathan, with that, I'll just give it to you to start with.
Great. So welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Sylvia. I teach drawing in EFS, which is our first year program. I've been at RISD for about 14 years, and I think primarily most of my experience will be around the first year crit, which could be a little bit different than, say, a graduate level crit or a second or third year crit. Okay, Mickey.
Okay, I'm Mickey Ackerman. I've been at RISD since, I like to say, since there were dinosaurs roaming around in Providence. So I've been here, this is my 41st year teaching at RISD. I've left a couple times for sabbaticals and leaves. I've taught in Asia, in Hong Kong, at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and also the Swire School there, and Glasgow School of Art. Teaching at RISD, I've been teaching, I taught in industrial design for about, I think, 28 years. And I was the head of industrial design for 15 of those. And for the last however many years, I've been teaching spatial dynamics in EFS. So experimental and foundation studies, students' first year at RISD. So I think we could start by talking about the first year crits and what a crit is like. Crit, we call them crits, but crit is short for critique. And it's a summation of the student's work after any one given project. And, I think we have lots of opinions about what crits are, but I would like to say that the critique is part of the RISD mystique. It really is. I think the nature of RISD happens in the critique. A lot of the work, a lot of the development, a lot of the learning happens in that period of time. So I actually, Jonathan, interrupt me anytime.
Okay.
So I have some particular opinions about critiques. I think that they've evolved quite a bit in the last couple of decades. I think they've come a long way, not just at RISD, but in art schools in general. They used to be, I would say, much more about criticizing and critical, and they were about and I think what's happened is that they've really started to evolve in many ways, and RISD's kind of done this quickly. I mean, I would say in the last couple of decades, RISD has really moved towards this idea of critique being more about a dialogue, communication, where the students are participants, active participants in their own education. So a critique happens when students finish a project and they present that work. And in presenting that work, helps them clarify their process, their understanding of their thoughts, and gives them insight into their own thinking and other people's thinking about their work. Go ahead, I'll let you jump in here, Jonathan, so I can take a breath.
Okay, so I would say that's exactly right. I think there is this mystique about critique. I think a lot of students arrive feeling anxious about that space that's created. For us, for me at least, during the first year, it's our semesters being normally 12 weeks long. It takes a few weeks to develop a platform really for critique, so it's not something that I would really jump into right away. It's about maybe making some work and then slowly, I have two phrases, which is like informal critique and then formal critique. So I think it's really important for our students to have that time to acclimate to an environment, such as RISD is so intense and they work so hard. But I really like to step our students through the critique process. And I think once they're adjusted, and sometimes it takes 2 weeks, sometimes it takes 3, sometimes it takes 6. But I feel like it's really important to create that communal platform before we even talk about what a formal critique is like. So, but I do think students arrive feeling there's a right or wrong way to do critique, or they're certainly afraid of doing critique. So I would be interested in maybe going back and forth with you, Mickey, about some of the ideas about a good critique and what a good critique is and a bad critique, in terms of maybe what the students feel about when they arrive, and then how we feel about them, or maybe being able to define what a good or bad critique is. So,
yeah. Well, I like your idea of informal and formal. When I talk about critiques, it does depend, especially with first year students, it depends where we are in the semester, because I think that it's important for students to kind of gain some insight into their own process and their own thinking, and to be able to articulate that in some form, and through their work also, but also verbally as they present their work. So one of the things I talk about in critiques is also the intent and the content. So what are you trying to do? What was the kind of the vision here? What was the attempt to do or solve? And then how did you go about doing that? And then as a community, which means, I expect my students to participate in the critique more than I actually participate. I just kind of help set the framework for it. And your peers have input, which is as valuable as anything else. And I think getting that is really important. And I think the hardest part is getting everyone to learn how to feel comfortable enough to participate. And people think like, well, I don't have anything really to say, or somebody else said that, or, I was gonna say that. And I think that by coaching students and helping them to kind of articulate their ideas helps them understand their own process as well as understand someone else's work. So, I think that's a big part of this, is how do you get to have students feel safe and supported. Now, what's a good critique and what's a bad critique? That's a good question. I think all critiques are good, even
Yeah.
bad ones.
Ditto.
It's like I tell students, even I'm a big proponent of internships, and I say all internships are good, even a bad one, because it'll tell you what you don't want to do. So, if you have a critique that you feel is seemingly, harsh, and I actually have seen some harsh critiques, and I would say more times than not, it's other students talking to students that really haven't engaged in their work. If they really haven't participated, other students will let them know. We'll let them know that their work is not, they haven't committed or made the same kinds of effort. And so I think that it's a self-regulating system, and it's by and large, I would say it's a supportive kind of environment. But it takes time to build that trust so that students feel free with each other. And some sections, some classes build that trust much quicker than others. And I think that's part of the goal or challenge for a faculty member is how do you help enable that trust to happen?
Right. We had a conversation yesterday about this very thing in my section, and it's really getting the students to understand. You know, everybody, we all want to be successful in some way with a project that we make. We want acceptance of that project. What I wouldn't define that as a really good critique. The best critiques are the ones where students really leave with more questions than answers. And so, and I find that they slowly get to understand. That gets them positioned in a much more, I think, much more successful way. And as the information changes in class, as we give or provide more information for those students, that critique also gets a little heavier or a little harder as we go. So the platform itself changes along the way. So we get to know who the students are. They get to know how we operate. And like to Mickey's point, we're more moderators, I think, right? We sort of moderate the environment a bit, and we make sure that you know, there aren't any you know, any unanswered questions, at least during that critique, to get a student where they're afraid to make work. You know, a student said to me yesterday, because we talk fairly openly in my section about critique, and if it's not going well, we'll stop them and say, let's, you know, why are we so quiet? What's, you know, one student said yesterday, well, what if I say the wrong thing? And so we talked about that for a while. So there are a lot of concerns around critique. Sometimes we have to talk about critique before we can get into critique. So I find that, you know, oftentimes I'll stop and just kind of get a feel for the space, see where everybody's at. I would say, you know, something I tell my students all the time is it's as important as making the work. It might be more important than making the work. So we really have to find a balance between the language and the making of objects. And so we really push that a lot in our studios. It's really super important.
Yeah, I think that the language part is key. The language part and the tone is really important. And that the nature of critique is a positive. That's why I actually don't like the word critique, because it sounds like criticize and it sounds like critical. But the nature of it is that it's a positive process where you're exchanging ideas, and it's the community of critics, community of thought. So
it's an honest one, right, Mickey? Yeah. It's an honest environment. It's meant to really, you know, it's about seeing, right? So and as that seeing changes, the language changes. So in order for us to really participate with students, it's all developed, like you said, intention and seeing, especially in drawing. So we talk a lot about what we see. And that's what, to answer a student's question about how do they feel if they say the wrong thing, it's like, well, if that's what you're seeing or feeling or thinking, even if it comes out in a way where we need to talk about it, it's important that we do at least open that up to this honest sort of approach to what we're seeing in the work, or to Mickey's point, what the intention is, and we can help you from there. But it really does take the commitment of the students first to really develop a really strong language, I think.
I think a byproduct of the critique is also students build very strong bonds with each other.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of friendships happen because how they kind of work with each other in the studio environment and in this kind of critique environment, as they're kind of all working together. I mean, more times than not, I've seen students kind of helping each other in the last couple of hours before critique. You know, if someone's finished with their work, someone else is off helping someone else on their project. So, you know, it does help to build this idea that, because a lot of our work is solitary and it's hard to build that kind of collaborative effort and momentum, and critique does help that.
Right. And to your point, sometimes when the students are adjusted, when they have those relationships that you're talking about, Mickey, I even ask them to stop the work an hour early, maybe if they're in the studio, and get together before they present the next day or the next, the next week, and talk amongst themselves, really develop some language around, because I think sometimes with the faculty or maybe with the teaching assistants, it can be a little bit different, but I think if they practice, in their studios where it's a little more free, they're a little more relaxed, I think they can tend to carry some of those things into a critique, if it's with everyone. So, and there are so many different types of critique, right? There's so many, every faculty member probably has their own little way of introducing it. And there are presentations, and then there's sort of what we call cold crits. And so yes, there's so many different types.
I was just going to say that there's probably as many different kinds of approaches to critique as there are faculty at RISD. Right. So, and there are many times when faculty will invite other faculty or external critics to the critique environment. Teaching upper class students, there are many times if we're working with an outside project or a corporate sponsor, there'll be professionals in there involved in the critique. But there's still the kind of guiding light of the experience is that it's an educational environment for the students to kind of learn and grow.
No question. I think some of the best critiques that I've had have been over this past summer when I had multiple faculty in a critique, and the feedback from the students was, I think they felt it was really wonderful. And we don't always have to agree. That's the nice thing is that, we all see something different. We all have something to contribute. And so I think for the students realizing the diversity within one room, right, is really amazing that we can have different opinions, and we might not see eye to eye, but we agree to disagree, or,
or we agree to have different opinions, because I think that helps the students find their own way and create their own kind of point of view. And that's what it's all about, is how do you kind of cultivate and encourage them to gain their own point of view and to understand it and to have a process that they can work with that's repeatable.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good word, cultivate. And even in the sharing of information, right? Being, maybe choosing your language carefully in a critique as a faculty member, I think is super important, right? Because we're always building, we're always moving forward, right? Even if there's a pause in that, it's always forward, thinking it forward through critique. And if there's silence or awkwardness, or we try to absorb that, because it really is we try to cultivate an environment, right, that we know will then, they'll take those experiences with them to their next studios or their next majors. And so it's a very good word.
Yeah, I think the silence part is actually fairly important. Sometimes
it happens.
Sometimes to have that silence, that moment of silence where no one's talking and they're waiting for the faculty member to kind of jump in, and sometimes you just have to wait, and then students feel free enough to kind of speak.
Right. And I think there are also critiques that we will do during the process, right? So maybe it's not a finished product yet, but we'll look and we'll talk about the outside work being in process and what's that like. So we're talking a little bit differently about maybe not worrying about the final product quite yet. So that critique strategy might be a little bit different as well, right? Because you're not presenting yet. It's just nice. Again, I'll use Mickey's word, cultivate an idea. So that maybe there's a different strategy that goes into that. And sometimes I know faculty will do written critiques, right? Those are smaller critiques. They'll have students write on note cards and pin it to the work. And so there's all, there's all different kind of ideas about how to get the students, talking about the work, right? Without fear of making that, that mistake. So.
Yeah, I think that for us, I'll have things, I call them reviews. It's not actually really a critique, because a review might be a one-on-one or a smaller group of students kind of getting together, and then I'll call my critique, it's just the language here. A critique will be with the entire class, kind of reviewing work at the end of a project, or possibly also in the middle of a project. And you're kind of actively looking for students to kind of participate. And that is the kind of the key thing in getting the critique to work, is getting students involved in the process and having them speak up and talk a little bit about their work. And for some students, I think it's very difficult at first, and other students, it's not difficult at all.
Right.
And it's really kind of helping to regulate that so you can let the students who don't speak learn to speak and feel confident about speaking about their work and about others.
That's a separate strategy in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
So I think it's, I think it grows along with the work, like I said earlier. So if the skill set isn't there in the beginning, or it's just held in check, it's something that we work on through the entire semester, or through the entire year, right? Because the students will have a different experience into their second year when they first enter their majors. So the critique structure may be very different there. So that's the sort of the really nice thing about first year is, so many different faculty members, so many different ways of going about critique in preparation for, their major, which hopefully then is preparation for their careers. So lots of different ways.
When I said earlier that the critique is part of the RISD mystique, it's this idea that, it can be a magical moment. I mean, because there's so much, students work so hard on their work, and you're so engaged that you just see the work, and you see the work from where you are. And all of a sudden, once you present it, you now can see the work from other people's perspective. You can start to see it from other views. And it gives you a chance to kind of step back and think about, how did you think about it? How didn't you think about it? What did you not look at? Or how you could look at this differently? Or how could you communicate this a little stronger? So all of those things start to happen in that environment.
Right. So it's really, it's ultimately it's up to the student what they choose to. I mean, we hope that they're open to all suggestions, right? We hope that they're engaged and they're listening and they're focused. But really, in the end, it's up to the student to sort of, like you said, sift through all of this information and continue to find their own sort of thumbprint, right? To sort of grow that and be really secure with all the other ideas that maybe they have to put aside for a while, but to really be secure about the decisions that they make. So and oftentimes that's a lot more information than all of us can really handle, right? So we sort of talk about that as a critique, is how again, back to Mickey's point of intention, right? Or in in a particular project where students want to put so much into one project, right? Their whole 18, 19 years of experience, right? So sometimes it's getting in there and dividing up the information, which is appropriate for this project. So we talk a lot about not feeling like one project encapsulates a student in any particular way, right? Through critique, it is one of many that you will have, as long as we're carrying information forward to the next one and we're getting better at it as a group. They really are the, especially at the end of the semester, when I think back to my best experiences at RISD, they're usually during finals, because students are adjusted and they have a year under them of experiences, and they're completely different students in a year, confident and articulate, and there can be amazing experiences for sure.
Yeah, I think they're great growth experiences. I would say I try to set some ground rules. I was talking to my class last night because I have a online class we have one section online this semester. And I was talking to them last night about critiques and the certain kinds of rules I have about critique. And they're not many, but the first rule is, don't start off your critique with telling everyone what's wrong with your project. Like, oh, well, I didn't get to do this or I didn't get to do that, because sometimes people never see that, or some people will see that. But it's like, think positively about what you have done and feel confident in the work you've done. Don't start off by saying, this isn't right, that's not right, and this didn't work. Really so it's trying to get them into a mindset where they can be proactive and think positively about their work. So it's really important to gain that confidence in what you've done and how you've done it.
Right. Okay.
Do we have some questions?
I believe we do. Looks like there are 2 questions in there.
Yeah, there's a couple questions. So the first question, I think, sort of speaks to the role of that you play or professors play in this process. So the professors know much more about the field than students. So shouldn't they play a larger role in the crit than the students?
Okay, that's, do you want to answer that or you want me to?
Give me a minute to think about that one. It's a good question.
Okay, I'll start to freelance with it. How about that? So,
Yeah.
so well, the professors may know a lot more about the field, but in EFS, we don't know what the field is. My field might be industrial design, but I might have a student who's going into illustration, film, video, apparel, and I think that the goal here of the critique is not really. We're not training them to know how to do this, that, or the other. We're actually giving them an exposure and helping to educate their point of view and their process. So, I think it's a good question because, students are kind of looking for answers, and most of the answers are within themselves. They just haven't been cultivated. They haven't kind of really formed them fully. And that's what they're learning here at RISD, is really how to kind of formally express your ideas, communicate them in ways that you didn't have access to before. So I'll give it to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I like to say that, yes, I probably have the most experience in the room, right? But I'm really cautious in how I go about sharing information. So I think it really is, it takes time. I think, this thing that we do, creating objects, I mean, they're so connected to the individual. Like it's really, so I think the language really has to be structured around, like community or cultivating. We have a long-term plan for them for sure, starting day one. So I think the critique is a lot like that, in the sense of, if we were to come out and just, let all the students know that we are the experts in the room, I think that there could be missed opportunities with that sort of approach. Not that that's what the question was suggesting, but I really do feel we really have a plan for our students in terms of that first year experience, and it is it's a part of that strategy. I think it's definitely a strategy to feel like when a student is lost, that you can get them back on the path. But like Mickey said, it's like, what path is it? So it really is a conversation. They are conversations, and it takes more than, so,
Yeah. I think the power of the collective cooperative is what's important in the critique. It's this power of the collective thought, and it's the insight from different views. So it's really, it's kind of like integrated thinking, and it's about different approaches to solving the same idea or the same problem.
Yeah, that answered that.
Claire, do we have other questions?
Yes. So the next question is more of a process. What's the format of the critique? For instance, is it a 20-minute presentation by the student and then a discussion, or mostly a discussion? How is it structured?
That's a good question. I think that varies on critique to critique, and it varies where we are in the semester, the nature of the project. If the project's, a 4-week project or a 1-week project or a 6-week project, the length of the crit will vary depending on the length of the project. But these are for my class. So for Jonathan's class, they could be different. So I think the kind of the nature of the project also kind of dictates how much time and effort and work So if I gave someone a project and I gave them 3 hours to do it, the critique might be a certain kind of relatively short, whereas I gave them 3 days or 3 weeks, it would be different. And the process, I think I've varied over the years. There are different processes that I've used. You know, sometimes I'll just say like, who wants to go next? And we'll just kind of go around the room and figure out who shows their work. But many times the people who are kind of shy and quiet always seem to go last. So now I kind of work it around where I either assign times, or people who go last the last time go first the next time. So I kind of mix it up. And I would say that when it's a midterm or a final critique, I usually assign a certain amount of time for presentation and discussion. So, but I would say it's really different in many ways. I taught a class at between ID and MIT, and up there, it's like each presentation is 15 minutes. And when they say 15 minutes, it's 15 minutes to the second. So RISD has the nature of some critiques going on for hours and hours and hours, and others are short. It really depends on the faculty member and the size of the class.
Yeah, I feel like that's a hard strategy for me to put a time on each one. And I've tried many different strategies, but I think for 20 minutes, if, you know, would be 18 minutes too long for some students, and, you know, maybe 30 minutes too short for others. So I think that I think part of my strategy early is to get students to do presentations. So they're sort of like pre-critiques in a way, I guess. They'll present something that they're familiar with, they're confident with. And so I give them a platform to collect 10 images of their choice. And oftentimes it's family members or pictures of cats, usually a lot of cats, a lot of dogs, and just where they're from, favorite foods, just and they talk about, you know, what to present amongst themselves right during the first week. And then we slowly go through those in a really informal way. And then you get a sense of how this student really can, how they speak, how confident they are, how long they take to speak. Do they flip through those 10 images in 10 seconds? Do they take 10 minutes? And so I think it's sort of creating that environment for other students to see, or just to participate in the many different ways. We could have 20 different presentations, and hopefully all of them are completely different. So don't really put time on them, which can be tough. But the one thing that we will do is, and I know other faculty do it, they'll leave time at the end of the day or after class to make sure that, again, that there isn't questions are answered. So we might be able to pick it up with a few students if they feel like they still have questions about a critique. So we'll try to, you know, but it's hard with 20 students. You have to really, and they get longer. So the critiques in the beginning might be 10 or 15 minutes each. And as the semester grows, they might be half an hour each. And then finals, they may be presenting, you know, as much as like 45 minutes to an hour each project. So they'll have a small presentation for 10 minutes and then open discussion for 20 or something. So, yeah, but you really have to feel that out. You really have to feel out that time.
So I do something similar actually in terms of presentations, which kind of lead to critiques. So you could say there's presentations, there are reviews, and there are critiques. And the first day of class, I actually have each student present something about themselves, and they have a certain amount of time to do that. And then after they've done that, I ask the rest of the class to tell me about what they presented. So I'm kind of seeing who's hearing, who's listening, and, you know, we start to get some feedback. And that's kind of actually a fun kind of icebreaker in class in terms of people feeling, you know, starting to learn about each other and feeling a little free to talk to each other. And then I do have them also make presentations on something that's not their work. Usually it's kind of presentations on artists, designers, both from history and contemporary artists and designers. So they're all doing those things throughout the semester. So they become familiar and comfortable presenting.
So I have a bunch of questions that are sort of, I think you sort of spoken to some of this, but it kind of preparing students for the crit process. You know, how do you balance providing constructive feedback that may not always feel great to the students while balancing the development of the ego of a new developing artist? That's one. Is there modeling and shaping regarding how statements are made and voiced? Can you speak to mean comments? And then how do you, I think you've kind of talked about how you prepare students for this process of critting, but you know, how are first years prepared for this? I think they're all kind of speaking to the same thing.
Yeah, I think a big part of that is kind of listening, you know, a big part is trying to listen to students. You know, in terms of mean comments, I think I don't think there's any place or space for that at RISD in the classroom or at RISD anywhere. So, you know, and I would say that students by and large are very supportive of each other. I'd say RISD's competitive in a lot of ways, but it's people are competitive with themselves mostly. You know, they're kind of working on their work because they're not all doing the exact same thing. So I would say that you know, it's students at RISD are really committed and dedicated to their work, and it's self-evident by just walking through studios and seeing a crit in process.
And I think we all acknowledge how hard it is. It's a really hard thing to make work and to share it and feel vulnerable about some things, and so it's hard. You know, we'll address that day one. You know, just setting the platform for comments. So they're, like, to Mickey's point, they really do develop together, and especially first year, where, you know, when they're matched in their own section, those are the students that they stay connected with for 4 years. It's that first year experience, that first month experience with your section, and they travel to those 3 majors with that section. It really does alleviate a lot of that that pressure to outdo one another in a critique, or by saying or positioning themselves with more knowledge, or saying something mean is rare. It happens. It does happen, and, you know, you openly talk about it. I mean, that's you know, you can't have a student feeling like their efforts have gone to waste. And it's not. And, you know, there's a saying that, you know, you're critiquing the idea and not the person. But it's a harder thing to separate. But we do talk about things that are that seem, you know, maybe not mean, but sharp, I think maybe is a good word, or how something was asked or questioned. So it's open for discussion, those types of things. So, but to Mickey's point, it really are supportive of one another, being in a new environment together. So.
Yeah, I think it is. I think you have to be very sensitive to it, because I do think students are, especially first year students, are just forming their ideas. They're kind of, they can feel very vulnerable and exposed. But I would say RISD is an amazingly supportive, accepting atmosphere. And I know I sound like propaganda for RISD, even we're having a critique talk here, but, you know, it's one of the reasons I've been there for so long. I mean, I think that it's been an amazing environment for a lot of students. And it is true that most students, you know, I've had thousands of students now, and I stay in touch with so many of them, and more students than not say they're, you know, they remember their freshman year, and the friends they made their freshman year, they still have years and years later. So, you know, I think that it's an important time, and it is a delicate time, and it's a time to be attentive and to be listening, for students to listen to each other and for faculty to listen to the students.
So the next one is about the about imposter syndrome in art and design education, and how do you seek to intervene in that or ameliorate that through the CRIT process?
That's a tough question. It's a tough
That's
question.
why I'll let you answer it.
Yeah. I think it's, I think to Mickey's point, it's important to listen to really, I often say like my greatest superpower is that I can listen really well to my students. I think maybe it's my only superpower. It's really, they really are sifting through so many important things. So I think listening helps deal with that. And I think having experience as a faculty member, whether it's the years that you teach or the students that you teach or your personal experience being a maker or an artist along the way. I was thinking about the question here that's been asked about how does the critique really play a significant role in future careers and lives. And I remember my very first year teaching, there were 3 or 4 guest artists that were invited to give a lecture about their work, a panel. And I went, and didn't know if I should go or whether I was invited or not. So it was all of those moments, just like a student when they walk through a class and they don't know, like, should I speak? Should I go? Should I not participate? So I think it's having those experiences that, that sometimes, when Mickey says that he's been teaching here, for 40 years, I mean, there's a lot, there are experiences even in faculty meetings where you feel like you're a better listener at times, right? So I think it's really being aware of your environment, and talking to students about how, again, one idea does not encapsulate them, not a good or a bad. It's part of the process, right? It's part of the development process of, and I find that students that have or deal with imposter phenomenon they have so much to say. They're so strong in how they think about the world or their ideas that it really is, again, it's a position of listening to those students and offering a strategy. And sometimes maybe it's a slow strategy, a weekly strategy of the sharing of ideas. So I think it's for faculty to really focus on all 20 students in their section and to figure out what each individual student needs and requires. So, but to my point, when I sat on that panel, I remember one of the faculty feeling like I didn't belong, feeling like I was surrounded by people who had been there centuries. One of the panelists was talking about critique, and it was their memory of critique that she said she felt why she was so successful in her job because of meetings, right? She just equated those to meetings. Like, I'm always in meetings and there's always ideas flying around, and it's how to navigate that system with other professionals, right? So I always remember that, but also I remember sitting in that meeting as as a learner. So I think it's remembering that these students are learners. They're here to learn something. So I don't know. I hope that answers that question. It's a complicated one.
Yeah, no, only thing I would add to that is I think we're all learners in that process,
Right.
myself included. So, and I think that the process is very self-regulating, that students kind of help regulate the whole nature and process itself. You just have to let that happen. You have to give it the time and space.
So, sorry. So the next question is sort of building off something you just mentioned, Jonathan. And the question submitter says, you've addressed this a little bit. Can you speak more about how the skills students develop in CRIT and by learning to speak about their work and others' work help them in their future careers and lives, whether they pursue art and design or not?
Well, I do remember that. I do remember that one story. I also had a very different experience in graduate school to that, where I realized how important language was around students and how their experiences were vastly different than my own, even as a maker. And so I think it was my my first year in graduate school, I really realized the value of critique. It was a very intense program. And it just made it, again, we're talking about graduate level critiques versus first year critiques are very different, but you have to prepare, you have to read, you have to come up with a strategy before. You can't just make and show up. You have to, it is about cataloging that process along the way. So that was my experience. And, I just think it's a skill that, that communication with, whether it's a teammate or a faculty member or someone, is it's just important to have that skill to be able to work a conversation.
I think your point there is really well taken, that there is a big difference in what happens in the first year in critique and what happens later on in your junior, senior year and in graduate school. And I could kind of give a little example here, is that in 1990 in industrial design, we started a class where we took industrial design students and put them together with graduate students. These were undergraduate RISD students, and we put them together with graduate students at the Sloan School at MIT. And they were working in teams. So the students at RISD already had some crit experience. They were all juniors or seniors. So they felt pretty comfortable at RISD. And once they got up to MIT and they were put in teams with like 5 graduate students from MIT and 1 RISD student, our students would come back and they said they felt overwhelmed, outnumbered, and intimidated. And we'd say, kind of get used to it. And, those are the students, this is, Joe Gebbia and Brian Chesky, the Airbnb guys, they went through that class. So, you have to learn other skills. You have to learn other languages. If you want to be in design and you want to be successful in the design world, you need to also understand the language of business. So, being open and kind of understanding the way other people approach problems and gives them the opportunity, those designers, an opportunity to kind of have a seat at the table to actually help get things done, as opposed to just being a service to business. So it's understanding those languages. And in critique, you start to learn that and become very familiar with it. And that's where the critique does vary. It'll vary whether you're in later on, whether you're in apparel or you're in architecture or you're in ID. They will vary.
So a couple questions before we wrap up. I think we'll have like 2 questions left. So first is, what is the expectation after the crit in terms of changing, adding to, or adjusting the work?
I think it depends on the assignment, right, Mickey? It depends on...
Yeah, it really does depend on the assignment. For me, I think the learning happens in the crit. You're usually, the freshman year happens so fast, 12 weeks, 1 day a week, and it goes by in a blink, and the students grow and change so much from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, and even more by the end of the year. So usually you're just on to the next project. You're not really we're not trying to refine and refine. We're trying to really explore and expand. So I would say, it's rarely, it's not like, oh, that work isn't good enough, do it over. It's like, what did we learn from this? What did we experiment? How did we work? How can we work differently on the next project? Or what can we learn from this project that will impact the next couple of projects?
Right. Yeah, I would agree. It's definitely, we call it carrying information forward, right? So even though we may not be able to re-engage in that particular assignment, there's definitely another opportunity to bring that information, that what you learned from that last project critique forward. So And that way, they're sort of like really long conversations, right? As opposed to separate conversations. It's one long conversation solving different problems in different ways. So, but you know, for a student, if they ask, like they feel like they need to see it, they need us to see it. We always have the opportunity for a student to do that if they, whether it's they share it on a Google Drive or they bring it in the following week. You know, at least in my studio, there's an opportunity for that student to really rework something so they can see it differently. And then if there's an opportunity to talk about it, we certainly will make time for that. So.
Yeah, and I do have projects where we'll have what we call interim critique, where I'll have someone do a first iteration and then we'll add some ideas to it and talk about it and have them do a second iteration. But it's not, and if a student wanted to do something over and they had the time, there's nothing stopping them from doing that.
Sorry. Yeah, that's great. I feel like those comments too, I mean, not I get involved in I know I'm just the question asker, but those apply to the post RISD. What makes, you know, what do you carry through post RISD that makes that is special to RISD that helps you in your career? It's like that iterative thinking, but also like taking those pieces and applying them to other places, taking those things that are most important that you've learned and putting them in other spheres in other ways, but retaining that the things that were important that you really learned from. For me, just having worked with alums for so long, that seems like a really key piece as well. So speaking of alumni, our last question. I'm an alumna and I've talked to many other classmates who really miss formal and informal crits that we had at RISD. Do you have any advice for forming a group post-graduation?
Well, I would tell you, what was that? Would you say, Jonathan?
Oh, I'd love the idea. I mean,
no, I love the idea too. And I would say the best place to start to kind of look at that would be your alumni group. You know, I've done a couple of alumni sessions with Chris Hartley, and I think that, you know, connecting with your alumni group is a great spot, a great place to do that. I think the RISD alumni network is very powerful and strong, and if you kind of connect to a couple of friends that you had at school, and then, you know, it's so easy now to be connected online, and now everyone's living on Zoom. I think that might be a way to start to approach that. It is kind of magical, so I can see how people miss it.
Okay, well, sorry. My mouse finger is poor today. Well, I think that's it. Somebody did ask the last question, are we going to share this recording? Yes, this recording will be shared. We recorded it and it will be on our YouTube channel, and we will share it out with you in our families and alumni newsletters. So please look out for that. And it will be on the website. But Jonathan and Mickey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. And I appreciate your time. So, and thanks to everybody who joined us virtually as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.